Angels in space? Yes, and a patron saint to the rescue on this episode of Real Life Angel Encounters. Angels, we all have them. They're our unseen guides, our companions, our teachers, and they're all around us. Sometimes they make themselves known in the most miraculous ways. Join me, Level 3 QHHT practitioner, angel communicator, and Reiki master, Christy Clemens Hoffman, with stories from real people who have experienced uplifting phenomena and real-life angel encounters. Welcome back to Real Life Angel Encounters, the podcast for people who like positivity with their paranormal and who like spirituality with their spirits. Our first story this episode is from Jessica. You remember another story from Jessica, and that was of the pizza man from season 1. It was such an uplifting story. If you haven't heard it, go back and listen. It's also featured in my upcoming book, Real Life Angel Encounters. Real people share real stories of miraculous events, out this summer from O Books. Now, this story does come with a trigger warning. This story contains discussion of suicide and suicidal ideations. If you or someone you know is struggling with these thoughts, please call 988. They really do help. All right, this is the email from Jessica, and I had to dig a bit through the archives to get to this. She says, "Hello, Miss Christie. I have a very important story that I think I should share, especially for people struggling with mental illness. I was diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder and anxiety and ADHD when I was about 20 years old. I'm now getting closer to 40 years old, so it's time I get these stories out." Okay, well, Jessica, it's been a little bit longer than that. So sorry about that. All right, here we go. In 1993, I was preparing for my confirmation. I was almost 10 when I had a dream that later in life saved me from committing suicide countless times. To summarize, in the dream, I was playing outside with my sister and looked down the street. In the distance, I see an angel that was literally radiant, a soft glow around her, halo, wings, long white robe with some light blue garments, hands in a prayer position. She was 50 feet tall or more. She was standing next to a 2-story home in the dream, so I could judge height. It was more than glorious. The pure, unconditional love I felt she had for me was indescribable. I just had to get to her. In the dream, I floated down the street trying to get to her. The closer I got, though, she began fading away. Before she was completely gone, I said, "Wait, who are you? What's your name?" She said softly and in an accent that I didn't recognize, "Margharita." She was gone, and I sat right up in bed, ran downstairs to my mom around 5 a.m., completely sobbing and in tears. I was crying so hard I could barely speak. My mom hugged me and asked what was wrong and if I had a bad dream. Through streaming tears, I told her the dream and the love I felt from this angel. I felt she truly must be my guardian angel. I asked my mom and CCD teachers if there was a Saint Margharita, but they only knew of Saint Margaret. Yeah, there was no internet back then. My confirmation name was Margaret, although I always insisted this was a saint, and her name was clearly Margharita. From 13 to 20 years old, I had to suffer and fight off wanting to end my life. I prayed to God to make it end. The endless ups and downs of bipolar disorder was killing me. I begged, I pleaded, I cursed at him and questioned his existence, then cried because I was so sorry and hated myself for doing that and for doubting his existence. I hated myself when I would hurt myself. I begged my guardian angel and God and Jesus for help. I hid it all from everyone. I didn't understand why people weren't seeing the same things I was seeing. Why was I seeing things that weren't there? It turned out I was having hallucinations. It was torture. What kept me from ending my life was one thing only. I wanted to go where Margarita was. I couldn't get there if I ended my life. I had to get to where she went. About 6 years ago, or even longer now that I'm reading this, about 6 years ago, I overheard on TV that there was a group of Russian astronauts who saw angels in outer space outside the space station. What caught my attention was that they said they were very large, around 70 feet tall or so. Huh? That's strange. My angel was big too. Time to Google St. Margarita. Lo and behold, she does exist. St. Margarita of Cortona, one of the patron saints against mental illness and against insanity. Just wow. Oddly enough, her feast day is February 22nd, my favorite day of the year, 222. My favorite number has always been 22. So next year, I need to celebrate 222 2022. Okay, Jessica, I am sorry. I am reading this so late. It is 2025 now. I hope you got to celebrate. Well, isn't that a great story? I just love it when we can confirm these visions that we have, even in dreams of angels. Now, I had never heard the Russian astronaut story, and it definitely caught my attention. So, yep, I Googled it, and the story is true. Absolutely true. Imagine being in the vast stillness of space, in cramped quarters, under loads of stress, physical, mental, emotional, for days on end. Whew, this is a crazy story, so buckle up. It was July 1984, and Russian cosmonauts aboard the Soviet space station Salyut 7 were on day 155 of their mission, and the group reported seeing strange lights and beings. According to the commander, Oleg Atkov, and cosmonauts Vladimir Solovyov and Leonid Kizim, I'm sure I'm just mangling these names, so apologies, everybody. The space station was suddenly permeated in a mysterious orange light that appeared to enter from outside the space station and bled through a solid opaque wall. Okay, this story makes me think of Encounter 2.1 of this podcast, just like back in January, maybe February, when Rochelle shared a story of a light permeating the room at the moment that her mother passed. Yeah, doesn't that sound kind of similar, eerily similar? Anyway, for a short while, the orange light was so bright that it temporarily blinded the crew. When they regained their vision, they looked out the portholes for the source, specifically what they thought might be an explosion. Not a good thing to have in space, right? The Salyut had been through some fires previously, but what the crew saw next was more incomprehensible than the orange light. All of the cosmonauts reported seeing the humanoid faces of 7 angels hovering just outside the space station. According to ground control, the cosmonauts stated these were humanoid in appearance, both in faces and bodies. Plus, they had wings and halos. The beings kept pace with the space station for 10 minutes before vanishing. But there was also a second appearance. Several days later, on day 167, the crew was then joined by another team of 3 from the Soyuz T-12 spacecraft. Cosmonauts Svetlana Savitskaya, Igor Volk, and Vladimir Zanibekov. Apologies again for mangling that Russian. Shortly after boarding, the Salyut 7 was once again permeated in a warm orange light. Once again, they looked out the portholes, and once again, they saw that they were joined by angelic beings. According to the cosmonauts, the beings were the size of an airliner. This incident was quickly suppressed by the Soviet government, and the crew was cautioned not to speak publicly of the event. But that's not all. All of the cosmonauts also reported seeing a smiling angel. While some may dismiss the incident as the stress associated with an extended space mission, all crew members reported seeing the beings. After these strange experiences, the crew remained in the vessel for a record-breaking 237 days before their missions end. Huh, incredible. Now, this story came from techeblog.com, link in the show notes. Now, before we crack into the next story, I wanted to put a shout out there for my book, Real Life Angel Encounters. Real people share real stories of miraculous encounters, new from O Books this summer. The end of June, it's going to be out in the UK. I'm not sure the exact date, but July 1st, it's going to be out here in the US. So you'll want to get your copies. In fact, you can pre-order your copy now. Pre-order a bunch for your friends, for your family, for your neighbors. But the pre-order link will be in the show notes. And interesting fun fact, I had put out the pre-order link a couple of weeks ago, sent it to some friends and family, some contacts, and I think I posted it on social media as well, but just once. And within 2 days, it made it to number 2 in the category Angels and Demons on Amazon. Now, if we can get to 500 pre-orders before the book releases this summer, then it will go to the hot new release list across all categories. And that's really kind of a big deal. So please, 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 if you love this show, if you love the positive with your paranormal, if you love spirituality with your spirits, please go get your copy of the first installment of the Real Life Angel Encounters book series. While I'm asking for favors, this show is also nominated for a Women in Podcasting Award. Yeah, kind of a big deal. So this is in the storytelling category on women in podcasting. And there's only 2 shows in this category. So I think Real Life Angel Encounters has a pretty good chance. And my other podcast, Radiate Wellness, is also nominated for an award in the wellness category of podcast. As you can imagine, the competition there is pretty stiff, but I would sure appreciate your vote anyway. I'll put those links in the show notes as well. So please go vote. Only one vote per person, though. I'm sorry. I would say vote early, vote often, but they're keeping track of how many people vote, and only one vote per person per category. So please go out there and vote for both categories just once, but that's all we need. All right. Thank you so much. Enjoy this next story. Next up, we have Sally. Sally is in the Chicagoland area. And Sally actually has been on the other podcast, Radiate Wellness podcast. And Sally McQuillen has written a book about the passing of her wild child son, but has some stories to tell us today for this podcast. Hello and welcome back, Sally. It's good to see you again.
Good to be with you, Christy. A pleasure. I am thinking about what I included in my book and what I left out of one of the stories that I wanted to share with you. But in Reaching for Beautiful, there's a section where my son Christopher, we've sent him away to a therapeutic boarding school. He is in Arizona, and I am home with my other 2 younger children, and he has gotten to a point in his journey through sobriety that he's now mentoring other young men. And they did all sorts of wonderful little outings where whether it was to go to a sweat lodge in the vicinity or to go cuddle with baby wolves, or they had all sorts of things like this. But they went on a camping trip to the Havasupai Indian Reservation. And of course, my son being himself, they were jumping into rapids from, tall rocks and such. And they ended up approaching a cave, and they didn't have any of the proper headgear to see in the cave. So they're wandering through this cave, and my son inherited a number of things from me, to include not the best eyesight at night. And this is funny too. He didn't do a lot of, there weren't a lot of homework assignments on his laptop when, after he died, I went through his laptop. But there were a couple of assignments that were brilliant, if I do say so myself. They were his story of falling down a mine shaft, and then another story that he wrote. So I actually have in his words some of what took place, but I'm going to try to remember my own experience of it. But there he was, and there was a younger guy who I think looked as if he might be slipping. And when Chris reached out to support him, he ended up falling down into the bottom of this unmarked mine shaft. So it's the middle of the night, and we receive a phone call. And that phone call is that Chris has fallen. He was unconscious for a time, but that he was restored to enough consciousness that he could let them know that he was alive but injured. And they had gotten a helicopter to come and rescue him. But we later found out, fast forward, that the helicopter would not, had it been any later in the day, would not have been able to get to this particular spot. It couldn't have flown at night. Somehow it they were able to get to him and drop the rope down and help bring him. I was traumatized by being notified in the middle of the night that he'd fallen and that we were going to wait to see if he was paralyzed, because if he was paralyzed, the helicopter would take him to one location, but if he wasn't, it would take him to a different hospital. So that was sort of where we were. And then thankfully, we get a phone call that while he's been very badly injured, he is not paralyzed. And they were able to take him, lift him up, get him onto the helicopter, and take him to Flagstaff Hospital, where thankfully we have some very dear friends that lived in the area. We're going to try to meet him at the hospital. He fell on his right side, so he had hit his head and he had bleeding on his head, and he'd crushed his arm and his ankle, both of which ultimately needed surgery to put rods. He sort of became I don't know if you're old enough to remember the Bionic Man, but he sort of became a little bit of a Bionic Man. And he ended up, I mean, apparently his arm was broken in half, just about. So, and interestingly enough, the story is that they weren't properly caring for him at the first hospital. So, my friend and his whole family, his wife and their two children, got Christopher, who was in shock and excruciating pain, over to be seen by a special surgeon that our friend knew of. So they then got him, transported him there, and he immediately underwent these surgeries. Well, I was starting the next day, I was expected, I was a preschool teacher. So I
Mm.
was expected for these 2 year olds' first day of work, and I had my two children at home. And so my husband was able to go and meet them. And there was a long period of recovery. And then Chris came home, and we had sort of a sick bay here, during which time I remember going to the preschool, coming home. We had Chris on the couch. Joe was giving him shots for pain. We were sensitive to that because he was an addict, and we didn't want, here he was clean and sober for, 2 years. We didn't really want to interfere with that. And we were just taking the best care of him we could. But I don't know that we fully appreciated, because we were in fight or flight, the degree of trauma that he'd endured. It did affect his sleeping after that. And certainly we were traumatized in our own way, but we pushed ahead because we wanted him to be all better so that he could undertake a trip to Machu Picchu where he could again be a guide. So that was kind of the carrot, was this incentive to go to all of his physical therapy and etc. Well, fast forward 2 years, Christopher spends more time mentoring. And then ultimately, if you read my book, Reaching for Beautiful, you'll hear more about what transpires in those next years of his life. But he then does pass at the age of 21. Maybe it's more time than that. Let's see. So it was 4 years later. We were granted 4 more years with him after this near death experience. And I have since heard from mediums that there are typically any number of possible exit points that we might have in our lives. And he'd already had about two or three, and he was kind of pushing the limits by the time he had his ultimate one. So he dies, and at some point, I'm looking through his computer and I locate this homework assignment, which is the day I was. I don't know what he titled it, and I wish I had it in front of me, but it was something about the day I could have died and didn't. He describes what happens and lying, waking up in pain. And he then says, somehow, and we later discovered this was like a 30-foot mine shaft. So this was a really long fall.
Yeah.
He says he's lying there and he's wondering if this is the end. He was always an old soul. And he's wondering about his family because he's thinking about us. And he turns to see there's a man down there.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah, he doesn't know where he's come from, but here he is. He's found his way, according to my son, through some sort of passages and tells him to hold on. Help will arrive and all will be well.
Oh my goodness.
And so, lo and behold, he was evacuated just in the nick of time. He was then brought to a hospital that could properly treat these injuries and put him back together. And we were then gifted with 4 more years with our beloved boy. And at the time I first read this assignment, I thought, could it have been, the only person I could think of that could have been someone from the other side who might have shown up in angelic form, might have been my father. And it's interesting because my father and I had a difficult relationship, and there was at some point some plea of mine, which was sort of like, and I don't know that I made it at that time, but I remember making it during the course of Christopher's life because there were plenty of times to be saying prayers about his wishing him safety. But it was sort of like, Dad, you didn't really do a whole bunch here on earth, but could you look out for my baby? And so wondering if maybe that had been an opportunity that my dad might have come to his rescue in that form. But then it was really interesting. There were numerous mediums that we sought out and then were able to channel Christopher. And I think at some point the question was even asked, could that have been my dad? And it was sort of like, no, but it was an angel. It was an
I'm
angel.
hearing too that it wasn't your
Mhm.
dad, but someone
Nope.
unrelated. Did Chris ever? So you didn't even know about this until after he passed. So there were 4 years where when he was recovering and afterward, you didn't even know about this stranger showing up.
I didn't know about the stranger showing up, nor did I know that he'd been attempting to rescue this other young man and that he in turn he was trying to support him. Apparently, this young man, Jack, was starting to slip, and Christopher let go, sort of sacrificing himself in this way so that
Mhm.
Jack would stay up above. Something like this was part of the, and
Mhm.
again, due to my trauma around all of it, it doesn't say crisp in my memory. But I really do feel like this was an angel visit, that this was some sort of encounter that provided us with these extra years. And you'll laugh about this, Christy, because it syncs up with my son's personality. He would do things to shock me just for attention, to get. So he, of course, the only thing he was really relating afterwards was, yeah, mom, and just think if they would have come any later than they did, they wouldn't have even been able to get to me. It was just knowing that I was completely unhinged by this incident and trying to inject some humor to make everything feel all right.
Right. I mean, I love this kid. I didn't even know this kid. All I know is the stories you've told, and I love this kid. I don't know, Sally, if you've ever heard of the third man syndrome.
Yes, remind me, because there was one point during which in my grief journey I read about it and I can't think of what it is.
When people are in trouble like that, they're in the ocean after a shipwreck or they got thrown off the boat. When they're mountain climbing, get in a delicate situation, all of a sudden there's another person who shows up to help them out. Now they call it third man because, I guess the first story, the best known story, and I don't remember what the story was there were two people and then a third man showed up. So in Chris's case, it was a second man, but still. In fact, a couple of episodes ago on Real Life Angel Encounters, there was a third man story that took place in Appalachia. This family was rafting and kind of playing in the river and got stuck, got in a delicate situation. Someone showed up in dress pants and a dress shirt with sleeves rolled up and said, Here, waded in, pulled him out, and then disappeared. So that type of thing.
Absolutely. The things that I've seen on TV and from time to time. And this is another interesting piece of Christopher's story is that I've had for each of my children and loved ones multiple terms of endearment, but Christopher was angel of my world.
Really? Oh my goodness.
And so when we begin to become friends with his peers at college, one of them, Mish, is his best friend, he's told us before he dies. She, when we first meet her, says, he called me angel of his world. So
Oh,
he took that term of endearment and she then pulls her hair back and shows us her tattoos of an angel and a world. And I now continue to call her that. But what I've also experienced with various mediums that I've seen or heard them say is that he is my angel, that he is now my third man. And I feel that. I feel it. I feel as if, but I think that he's doing it not just for me, but for many of us here, that he's got some sort of, I mean, of course, I like to think this way, but like a special assignment so that he can continue to be involved with all of the people here on earth that he loves and pull some strings to guide them.
I love that. And I believe that our loved ones do help us in that way and can show up when we just right when we need them. Now, you said you had a couple of other real short stories.
Couple teensy tinies.
Yeah, let's hear them.
Okay, the first medium that I saw, I ended up, a friend of mine insisted that I do this, and I was a little bit skeptical, but my husband had gone to one and found comfort there. And he had this conviction in the afterlife that I was just trying to believe in. And so I went all the way to fly from Chicago to Denver, care of this very generous friend who got me into a small group reading with a very wonderful medium. Her name is Rebecca Rosen. And Christopher came through, and afterwards, she said, "Do you have any questions for me?" Well, of course, me being me, I had a whole list of questions, and I was just hoping to be able to get some of them in. But one of them was, "Will I be able to see my son again?" And she said, "Yes, he will be there to greet you. You are a magnet for him. He is kind of like an angel for you."
Oh my gosh.
And so that was part of the beginning of this appreciation for. I just also think about the fact that one medium that my husband had seen many years before Christopher died, he'd seen her once. And then immediately after Chris passed, I think he called her back.
Mhm.
So that was what got us back into this. That and our desperation and grief was what got us into pursuing connecting with these mediums. But she had described Christopher as an indigo child,
Oh,
that
yeah.
he answers to a different dimension, kind of. It just feels right that he almost was, in some ways, too sensitive and compassionate, almost beyond for this world.
Yeah.
So I then was talking to a different medium because we were, especially in the early days of our grief, sort of like, you get this sense that, oh, his spirit, they brought his spirit close. And then you question it immediately thereafter. It was sort of like, it felt like him. It certainly sounded like him in the words, that the way that, but was that really him? And when can we do this again so that somebody can facilitate communication with him? And this other wonderful medium that we came to know again said to me, and I said, do you just say this to everybody? Said, "Chris is your angel."
Oh my gosh.
She said, when he passed, and this might sound a little strange, it stopped me in my tracks at the time. She said, he found his way. She said, "Were you awake when he died?" Or something like that. And I said, I guiltily said, "I must have been sleeping." Because he ended up drowning and was missing the next morning. And I said, "He must have gone while I was asleep in my bed." And she said, "Well, when he passed, he found his way back into your body where he could hear your heart beating. When he was dying, he turned over to lie in the same position that he was in when you first carried him." And
Oh,
that ultimately was such a comfort to me. At first, it shocked me. And then I thought, I would love that, because one of the things that grieving
yeah.
mothers experience is a guilt that we couldn't be there. And if he was suffering or afraid in any way, I couldn't bear the fact, I couldn't bear the thought that I couldn't be there to comfort him. So to think in terms of, if this was all possible, that we could be reconnected in this way, those are some of my Christopher angel stories.
I love it. I love it. You certainly are blessed to, first of all, to have had a son like Christopher. And then, second of all, to have these beautiful confirmations that,
Truly such a gift. And I know, like, I feel really privileged about it, because he's that powerful, that he's been able to punch through and let us know he's here.
what a blessing. Well, thank you so much, Sally, for sharing these stories with us. I think it brings
Well,
lots of comfort to everybody.
I sure hope it's helpful. Thank you, Christy.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and follow, and be sure to share this episode. The more people who know about this podcast, the more great story submissions we get. Have a story to share? Email your own real life angel encounter to angelencounterspodcast@gmail.com, or visit radiatewellnesscommunity.com/real life angel encounters podcast, or join our Facebook group and continue the discussion. Want to know what your angels and loved ones have to tell you? Schedule an appointment with me at radiatewellnesscommunity.com. A special thanks to James Wheeler for the original music and to Tiffany Baumgarten for the logo design.